Chapter 5: The End of the Middle Ages. The English literary scene after the death of Chaucer is not inspiring. The 15th century, though it saw a significant increase in lay literacy and marked an important stage in the rise of the middle class, suffered from the confusions and demoralization of the long reign of Henry VI and of the Wars of the Roses which followed it. Significant new forces were indeed working in the national culture. The victory of English over French was now clear and complete. A new class of readers was slowly developing. The new movement of humanism was beginning to awaken English interest. And social and economic changes were bringing about the transformation of the feudal system into a freer society based on a money economy. But it was some time before these changes were reflected in any important new movement of the mind or the spirit. At the beginning of the 15th century it was clear that none of Chaucer's followers had his technical brilliance, his imagination, or his understanding of men. And there was none who could combine the courtly and the bourgeois tradition as Chaucer had done. 15th century courtly poetry sometimes uses the old modes with a certain freshness. The Flower in the Leaf, long wrongly attributed to Chaucer, uses traditional material with charm, giving a new twist to the handling of tapestry figures of allegorical significance by having the narrator woman and by having the two opposing sets of characters worshippers of the flower and of the leaf. The idle and the faithful treat each other with gentle friendliness, and other works of the Chaucer apocrypha have their own appeal, though none is as fresh as the Flower in the Leaf. The Cuckoo and the Nightingale is a debate using familiar properties. La Belle Dame Sans Mercy, which gave Keats a title, has a lover pleading in vain with a lady whose matter-of-fact indifference to his love almost breaks out of the whole courtly love tradition. The Assembly of Ladies tells in heavy allegorical detail of pleadings before the lady loyalty. We see here a tradition working itself out. Thomas Hoccleve and John Lydgate are the best known of Chaucer's followers in England. Their lives overlapped Chaucer's, and Hoccleve apparently knew the master personally. Yet they seem to belong to different ages. Hoccleve wrote less than Lydgate, but he is the more interesting for, though there is little to choose between the two on grounds of poetic merit or lack of it, there are realistic and autobiographical touches in Hoccleve's work that help to enliven it for us. He was a minor civil servant, a connoisseur of London nightlife and a tavern hunter, perpetually in need of money, seeking noble patrons and writing them begging verse letters. His Meal Regie tells the story of his misspent life and ends with an appeal to the Lord Treasurer to pay him his overdue pension. There are some fairly vivid touches. Where was a greater mistake than why a bet acquainted at Westminster yet among the taverners namely and coaxes? Van I cam, early or late, I pinched not at him in my gate. Wherefore I was the welcome Algate and for over a gentlemanly holder. And there is the well-known line access at board heart laid his KNYF with me. His longer works are mechanical and tedious. They include many translations, among them the Regiment of Princes compiled from a variety of sources. His religious and didactic works have little value as literature, though they seem to reflect a genuine piety, for all his love of taverns. Technically, his verse is extraordinarily unaccomplished. He is content if he produces the requisite number of syllables in the line, paying no attention to how they are stressed, while Lydgate, on the other hand, is happy if he has the requisite number of stresses and does not seem to care how many or what kind of unstressed syllables he has. He had a genuine admiration for Chaucer, and introduced into the Regiment of Princes stanzas in praise of him, O Master dear and for the reverend, my Master Chaucer, floor of eloquence, mirror of virtuous endowment. O universi fader in science. Elsewhere he hails him as the MST founder of our felon gauge. Chaucer, it is clear, became a legend soon after his death. But this does not mean that any of his English admirers had the ability to follow in his footsteps. Lydgate is almost universally written off as a bore. and though he has occasion of felicitous touches, there is little reason to disagree with this verdict. Unlike Hoccleve, Lydgate led a cloistered life as a monk, mostly at Bury 5T. Edmonds, and though this did not prevent him from managing to see a good deal of men and affairs, and certainly did not prevent him from reading widely. For the library at the Benedictine Abbey at Bury was one of the best stocked in England. He had nothing of Chaucer's gift of turning both his reading and his experience to lively account in his own writing. Over 145,000 lines of his verse survive, including the mammoth Fall of Princes from a French prose version of Boccaccio's The Cassibus Illustrum Virorum. The almost equally lengthy Troy book from Judo degli Alon's Historia Troiana, several lives of saints done for different patrons, several translations from the French, and many miscellaneous shorter poems, both secular and religious in subject. There is a deadening lameness in his versification, together with a syntactical looseness, which makes the reading of his longer didactic works a severe penance. Lydgate's were the routine didactic interests of the human adventurous spirits of his time, and we can at least console ourselves with the thought that his work illustrates the early 15th century English mind. He contributed something too, both to the themes of English literature and to the vocabulary of English. His Fall of Princes is the first full-dress collection of tragedies in the medieval sense of stories of falls from high to low estate of the many that were to influence English thought and literature up to Shakespeare's Richard II. His Danse Macabre introduced to England from the French a theme of great significance in medieval thought and art of the period. Death the Leveller, who addresses in turn all classes of men, Pope, Emperor, Cardinal, King, and so on down the scale to labor, friar, child, clerk, and hermit, points the grim moral of a common mortality which is found so often stressed in the 15th century. Lydgate added many new words to the English vocabulary, though he rarely employed them with much sensitivity or poetic force. They are mostly polysyllabic words from Latin or French, such as inexcusable, credulity, tolerance, and adolescence. But what the reader is most conscious of is his frequent use of tag phrases, sothly to tell, tahedness name to say, as to myn, intent, if I shall not lie, etc. Lydgate is at his best in his shorter poems, and in those where the demands of the narrative compel him to some liveliness of detail, and it might be added that his feeling for small children has been noted in his favor. A good example is his tale, The Churl and the Bird, rendered from the French. The churl has caught the bird and put it in our pretty little cage. The bird speaks. And though my cage forged were of gold and the pinnacles of beryl and crystal, I remember a proverb said of old, he who lesseth his freedom in faith he lesseth AI. For Tilda had lever upon a bronze small merely to sing among the woods green then in a cage of silver bright and sheen. Songe and prison hanune couldn't troast thou iwl sunshine prison. Songe proceedeth of Iowa and of pleasance in prison causeth date and destruction, but even emotion seeks in Lydgate to express itself in didactic or proverbial form. The professions of literary incompetence made by so many of these 15th century poets represent doubtless a mere fashion, but they spoke more truly than they knew. Among the little surviving verse of Benedict Burg is a short poem of compliment to Lydgate which begins in this common self-deprecatory vein: Na dreamed I in the Monoponasso. Ne drank I never at Pegasus Villa, the pale Pyrrhus saw I never, also the whist I never, where the muses dwell. John Walton, whose translation of Boethius into English verse shows better metrical control than most of his 15th century contemporaries, begins his prologue in similar strain. Insufficience of Canien and of Wyl, defort of Lang.Gen and of eloquence. This work from me should have withholden Ylt the anonymous author of the Court of Sapience. He may have been Stephen Hawes. A long allegorical, didactic poem in two parts, the first dealing with the dispute between mercy, peace, righteousness, and truth concerning the fate of man, and the second a conducted tour of medieval learning, varies the formula somewhat and speaks in livelier accents. He asks Cleo to forge my tongue to glad myn or Daiches, professing his own deficiencies. I know myself most naked in a lot, my commune vulgare most intepte, and I converse onto and born in the parties where my native language is most corrupt, and with most sundry tongues myx and rupt. The Court of Sapiens states from about 1470 it is more vigorous in expression and competent in metrics than anything by Lydgate. But in theme it represents the uninspired development of the allegorical didactic tradition. It seems as though the simple story romance, so popular with an earlier generation of Englishmen, had been pushed out by allegory and didacticism. And with the decay of feudalism and the slow but steady rise of a realistic and iconoclastic bourgeoisie, there was no new source of idealism to revivify the increasingly uninspired and conventional didactic allegory. But by a fruitful coincidence, the last flare-up of chivalry in the courts of Europe, a last Indian summer of knightly ideals in the earlier manner, occurred at the same time that printing came in. Caxton, who had been in Burgundy witnessing this revival at the French-speaking court of the Duke of Burgundy, brought with him from the Low Countries the art of printing on his return to England. The revival of interest in the chivalric story romance which accompanied chivalry's final fling was just in time to take advantage of Caxton's imported art, which accounts for the fact that some of the first works printed in England were chivalric stories of the older kind. This revival of interest in romance was brief. It was killed in the 16th century partly by the new movement of humanism which in England in its early phase took a narrow view of romantic tales and, with Roger Ascham, protested against idle stories of chivalry, and partly by the growing bourgeois taste for a more realistic, picaresque kind of story. The attenuated courtly tradition, satirical, topical, and political verse of little literary merit but of considerable historical interest, didactic, moralistic, and religious writing. These were the three main categories of 15th century English literature, and the third is the largest. The religious lyric, following the types discussed in Chapter 3, flourished during the period. Indeed, most of what has been said of the 14th century lyric applies to the 15th century also, though new themes and attitudes begin to make their appearance as the century advances, and will be discussed later. That the 15th century was a period of transition in England is obvious enough to the political and economic historian. The Wars of the Roses, where the nobility destroyed each other and the middle class rose steadily. William Caxton's introduction of printing into England. Caxton's translation of Our Lord the Fives le Reuel des Histoires de Troy, printed by him as Reuel of the Histories of Troy at Bruges in 1474, was the first printed book published in English, and his return to London in 1475 was followed by his printing in 1477 of Daiches and Sayings of the Philosophers, the first book printed in England. The gradual impact on English thought of the humanism of the Renaissance, the establishment of the Tudor monarchy in 1485, these are obvious and significant marks of change. In the literature of the period, however, we see for the most part simply the progressive exhaustion of earlier medieval modes. Yet much that appears at first sight merely to exhibit this exhaustion can be seen on a closer view to be influenced in some degree by new ways of thinking. Stephen Hawes' allegorical romance, The Pastime of Pleasure, dedicated to Henry VII in 1506, continues the lame versification and the mechanical allegorizing of Lydgate, with even less notion of the true nature of allegory than his immediate predecessors. The light of the rueth, I lack a cunning to cloak, to draw a curtain, I dare not to presume nor hide my matter. With the misty smoke my rudeness can clothes so consume, yet as I may, I shall blow out a fume, to hide my mind underneath a fable by covert colour, well and probable. It is a curious view indeed that the function of allegory is to obscure truth. Yet this smoky, didactic, allegorical romance, telling in first-person narrative of the pursuit and eventual attainment by the heroic Grand Amour of La Belle Pucelle shows some interesting new features. The hero, encouraged by fame, a lady, and accompanied by governance and grace, 2 greyhounds, receives an elaborate education in the Tower of Doctrine before engaging on the knightly adventures which culminate in his marriage to La Belle Pucelle. Here we have the union of the active life and the contemplative life which had hitherto been sharply distinguished in medieval thought. Following St. Augustine's influential statement in The City of God that the study of wisdom is either concerning action or contemplation, and thence assumes 2 several names, active and contemplative. The active consisting in the practice of morality in one's life, and the contemplative in penetrating into the abstruse causes of nature and the nature of divinity. The knight and the clerk are united in Grand Amour, representing a new ideal of lay education. Further, the hero's love for La Belle Pucelle is chaste and Christian and leads to marriage, something quite impossible in the earlier courtly love tradition. The interest, one might say the obsession with education, is characteristic of the age. The combination of the didactic romance with the romance of knightly adventure in the context of education looks forward to Spenser's Faerie Queene. And at the end, after the hero has married and lived happily ever after, he addresses the reader from the grave in the one memorable stanza of the poem, O mortal folk, you may behold her and say how I lie here. So to me a mighty knee, the ender of joy and all prosperitas date at LASL through his course in my MTER the day there cometh the dirk NYGHT. For though the day be never so long at last the bells ringeth to even song. The 7 deadly sins and fame, time and eternity all play their part in the final pageant, which shows a certain grandeur of conception in spite of the technical inadequacy of the verse. How dismal to the point of being positively comic the verse can become is illustrated by the following passage describing the hero's education in grammar at the hands of Dame Doctrine, to whom she answered right gently again, sighing alway that a noun substantive might stand without help of an adjective. The Latin verde, which that is referred unto a thing, which is substantial for a noun substantive as well a word, and with a gender is declinal. So all the I parties in general are Latin words, annexed properly to every speech. For to speak formally, this intolerable doggerel is representative of a whole area of late medieval English didactic verse. Yet not only does the pastime of pleasure have its moments of perception and even of eloquence, it is also a work of considerable historical importance in that it illustrates an attitude toward love education, and the relation of the active to the contemplative life which foreshadows both the courtesy books of the Renaissance and the use of romance made by Spenser. Hawes saw himself, however, as a follower rather than as a pioneer, and he mentions Gower, Chaucer and Lydgate in that order as his masters, listing the major works of the latter two. He seems utterly unaware of Chaucer's superiority to the other two, and Lydgate is especially praised for his eloquence. O Master Lydgate, the most dulcet spring of famous rhetoric, with ballad royal, the chefer original of my milk, what whileth it on you for to call me for to I day, Norway in especial. Sithen your body is now wrapped in chest, I pray God to give your soul good rest. Hawes' other allegorical didactic romance, The Example at Virtue, is shorter and less interesting, and few other late medieval exercises in this mode have any special appeal. William Neville's Castell of Pleasure, 1518, is worth mentioning only because its printer, Robert Copeland, himself like Caxton a translator and dabbler in letters, introduces a dialogue between the printer and the author at the beginning of the poem, and because in its mechanical use of the allegorical formulas it sinks to probably record depths of dullness. Nowhere is the popular medieval obeisant theme handled so flatly, whereas Tully, which had principalite over all orators in parfait rhetoric, where behold the 4 doctors of Divioit, whereas Aristotle for all his philosophy and logic, Alexander Barclay, ca. 1475 to 1552, is a transitional figure of some importance. His Ship of Fools 1509 provided a new metaphor for English satire. It is a rendering of the Narrenschiff of the German Sebastian Brandt through the Latin translation of Locker, a Swiss. But Berkeley's own comments expand the poem to many times the length of his original. Satire, of course, was not unknown in the earlier Middle Ages. The fabliau tradition, as we have seen, is largely satirical, and John the Mun, Chaucer, and Langland have each his own satirical vein. The conception of the important people of the world as a collection of fools, courtiers, ecclesiastics, scholars, and merchants alike seems to have become popular in the later Middle Ages. And Brandt's idea of putting them all in a boat sailing off to Narragansett gave a new liveliness to the whole conception. It is a development of the older handling of the 7 deadly sins. And the shift of attention from moral evil to intellectual folly is significant of a new temper in European civilization. The Ship of Fools looks forward to Erasmus' praise of folly as much as it looks backward to title theme of the 7 deadly sins. Its interest is more in the contemporary social scene than with moral types, and this again marks an important development. Berkeley's rhyme royal stanzas are pedestrian enough in movement, but the self-characterization of the representatives of different kinds of folly provides some vivid glimpses of the society of the time. Satire, so long directed against ecclesiastical abuses, is beginning to turn to wider themes including life at court, increasingly important with the establishment of the new national state with its centralized monarchy and intellectual fashions. The satiric stream widens and deepens after Berkeley, with Skelton's Bourge of Court and Speak Parrot concentrating on the contemporary scene. The changes which Renaissance court life and the first effects of Renaissance humanism brought with them stimulated conservative minds to angry satire. And while the attack on folly is itself a humanist theme, attacks on humanism as well as on other novelties are made by angry conservatives. Indeed, angry conservatives have always produced the greatest satire, from Aristophanes to Swift. And while neither Berkeley nor Skelton can be regarded as a great satirist, they do share the great satirist's sense of outrage at what contemporary man is making of himself. The pastoral also becomes at this time a vehicle for satire. In English, it comes to replace the dream as the commonest kind of machinery for satirical as well as many other purposes. Berkeley produced 5 eclogues, 3 translated with many expansions from the Misericordalium of Pope Pius II Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and 2 from the late 15th and early 16th century Italian poet Baptista Mantuanus, known as Mantuan in England, where he was much admired for his Latin pastorals in the 16th and 17th centuries. Thus a new breath from classical literature comes, though indirectly, into English literature, the first of very many such. The use of the pastoral for satire of court life, urban life, ecclesiastical corruption, and other abuses of the time, as well as to discuss literary questions, established itself early in the Renaissance. Berkeley is the first English writer to use a device already common in Italy, which was to be developed significantly by succeeding generations of English poets, notably by Spenser in his Shepherd's Calendar. And as the Shepherd's Calendar, as we shall see, is in some sense both the manifesto and the first fruits of the new English poetry, the pastoral tradition is clearly of prime importance in English literature. We shall have to look at it more closely later. John Skelton, ca. 1460 to 1529, is the most interesting and original of all the transitional poets who, while considering themselves in the tradition of Chaucer, Gower, and Lydgate, are in fact Janus-faced, looking both toward the medieval past and to the Renaissance future. As a satirist, Skelton attacks the abuses of courtly life, new fashions in thought, religion and behavior, personal enemies, Scots, and aspects of the contemporary scene which he found annoying. The Bourge of Court is a satire of court life in the traditional rhyme royal stanza, combining traditional medieval allegorical figures with the ship of fools device. The characters being sometimes allegorical personages and sometimes lively representatives of the contemporary scene. Less traditional in form and content to speak parrot. A bubbling satirical piece mostly in rhyme royal but with some parts in other meters, the poet speaks through the bird in a characteristic mixture of bitterness and clowning. But Colin Cloughton, why come ye not to could represent his most characteristic and original satirical vein. The verse here is that short two-beat line which has become known as Skeltonics. The poems move with breathless abandon from point to point, highly personal in tone, deliberately discursive in progression, mingling fierce abuse, clowning humor, and bitter irony. Latin tugs and even whole passages in rhymed Latin couplets, echoes or parodies of the church liturgy or of the arguments of the schoolmen, are sprinkled freely among the wild and whirling verses. The life, the abandon, the high spirits, the reckless vitality of these pieces make them utterly unlike anything that English literature had yet produced. In the book of Philip Sparrow he uses a similar technique to lament the loss of a young girl's pet sparrow. The lament is put into the mouth of the girl, and ends with Skelton's own tribute to the girl's charm and beauty. Its parody of the office for the dead and other aspects of the Latin liturgy of the Church is done with a cheerful recklessness reminiscent of the Goliardic literature of the Middle Ages. The verse itself is crudely accentual, whether it derives from the breakup of a longer line or from medieval Latin poetry or from another source cannot be precisely determined, but it moves with extraordinary speed and vigor. So meety me he wold gaspe van he severe waspe, a fly or a gnat he wold fly at that, and brightly he wold punt the van he saw an ant. Lord, how he wold pry alter the butterfly. Lord, how he wold hop alter the grasshop. And van I sight pbyp pup, then he wold lep and skype, and take me by the lyp. Alas, it will me slo that Philip is gone me fro. See Nike Tatis, A1ers. I was evalates, the proton disceleray when I survey my sparrow die. The color and life of Skelton's most characteristic verse is perhaps best seen in the turning of Eleanor Rumming. A remarkable description of an alewife and the goings-on in her alehouse. Come whoso will to Eleanor on the Hyle, with file the cup, file, and sit there by style, early and jarty, thither cometh Kate. Sisley and Sep with their legs bare, and also their fate hardly full and swait, with their hair lace dagged, their kirtles all twigged, their smocks all to ragged, with litters and tatters. Bringy dusters and platters, with all their might ninge to Eleanor Ruminge, to have of it ninge, she learneth them of the same, and thus beginneth the game. His garland of laurel is an elaborate set piece in praise of himself. Fame and Palace discuss his qualifications. Gower, Chaucer, and Lydgate hail him. A group of noble ladies make a laurel wreath with which to crown him. The incidental lyrics addressed to these ladies are in a new vein of lyrical tenderness. Notably that addressed to Marjorie Wentworth, with Margarine Gentle, I the hovery of de goody heed. Embroidered the mantalas of your maidenhead. Magnificence is a morality play with allegorical characters, showing how magnificence is deceived and undone by vices, conquered by adversity, and finally redeemed by good hope and perseverance. It is aimed at Wolsey, but also has its general application. Skelton moved in a humanist atmosphere without fully realizing it. His satire was conservative in intention but in fact revolutionary in unconscious implication. His fiercely individual temperament, the wanton putting of beer into casks, vigor which he infused into his rough accentual verse, his ambiguous relation with the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII, his attacks both on church abuses and on radical reformers like Wycliffe and Luther, his bitter feuds with so many of his contemporaries, his strange mixtures of anger and tenderness, of self-conceit and moral indignation, of prophetic elevation and low abuse. show a highly individual temperament coping in a strongly individual way with some of the bewildering cross-currents in the civilization of his day. His lively and unpolished verse and his violently personal manner attracted English poets in the 1920s and 1930s who were looking for a style in which to express similar reactions. And Pope's verdict of beastly skeleton has in recent times been enthusiastically reversed. Meanwhile, the revival of interest in feudal ideals which, paradoxically but understandably, accompanied the final decay of feudalism in England, produced in the prose Arthurian tales of Sir Thomas Malory the greatest of all its monuments. Malory, who appears to have been a mid-15th century knight of lawless behavior who wrote his stories in prison, turned first the English alliterative romance known as Mort Arthur, and then a variety of French romances about Arthur's knights, into a series of tales of Arthur and his knights in which the ideals of practical chivalry replace the sentimental and doctrinal elements which figure so prominently in his French sources. He cut his way through the tangle of complexly interwoven tales fitted together in pieces like a Chinese puzzle with which his originals so often presented him, and, to use Caxton's term, reduced his material to a coherent group of related stories in which incidents followed each other with less interruption and the emphasis was on action and motive rather than on sentiment or doctrine. Caxton published the work in 1485, giving it a false unity by applying the title of the last group of stories, the Mort Arthur Sans Guerdon, to the whole collection. The discovery in 1934 of the Winchester MS of Malory's stories makes it clear that Le Morte d'Arthur is Caxton's title for the whole, not Malory's. Malory's work is in 8 tales or groups of tales, each group originally written separately as an independent work except for the 6th and 7th, which are explicitly linked in Malory's colophon to the 6th. The first, though apparently the second in order of writing, is the comprehensive tale of King Arthur. It begins with the death of Uther Pendragon and Arthur's accession, and tells of Arthur's victorious wars against rebels and hostile neighbors, the stories of Balaam, Gawain, Toi and Pelena, much about Merlin, the plottings of Morgana Ife, Arthur's half-sister, and a group of adventures engaged in by Gawain, Yawain and Mahalt. The second group, the tale of the noble King Arthur that was emperor himself through the dignity of his sons, was apparently the first to be written and derives from the alliterative Morte Arthur. It tells of Arthur's struggle against the claims of Rome, the battle between Arthur and Lucius, Arthur's triumphant coronation as emperor in Rome. The third, the noble tale of Sir Launcelot du Lake, turns for its hero from Arthur to Sir Launcelot, who appears here not as the lover of Guinevere, but as an active and gallant knight who proceeds from adventure to adventure before returning to King Arthur's court, where the knights whom he has overcome testify to his prowess. The tale of Sir Gareth of Orkney follows. It is a characteristic story, from an unknown French source, of a questing knight whose adventures are rounded off by his wedding the Lady Lynette, whom he has championed and who at first scorned him, with feasting and jousting. The Book of Sir Tristram the Levens is the fifth. It is a simplified and reduced version of the French prose romance of Tristan, with the Grail material omitted. The love of Tristram, Tristan and Isolde, treated with emotional gusts and with no sense of doom, Tristram's adventures and achievements as a knight of the Round Table emphasized, and the lovers left at the end happily enjoy Asgard. Even so, Malory's Book of Sir Tristram is far from being a single tale. It is made up of many separate adventures, and is divided into 17 parts, easily the largest of Malory's 7 books. The Tale of the Sunk Grail is Malory's 5th book. It is translated from the French Quest del Saint Graal, but emphasizes what might be called chivalric humanism as the tilde-delaying ethical pattern, at the expense of the religious. Lancelot is less the repentant sinner of the French original than the former hero of the Round Table, whose chivalric ideals are never made to appear as basically inimical to the truly religious life. Malory plays down the basic dichotomy between Carbonek and Camelot, so important in the quest, though of course something of it does come through from his original. The Book of Sir Launcelot and Queen Guinevere is partly based on the French Morte d'Arthur, the final branch of the prose Arthurian cycle. This goes together with the final book, the most piteous tale of the Morte d'Arthur sans Gverdon, based partly on the Morte d'Arthur and partly on the English stanzaic Morte d'Arthur. And the two books arguing show Malory's characteristic minimizing of the religious in favor of the chivalric moral. Lancelot loves both his mistress and his king. These two chivalric loyalties are incompatible, and in the end they destroy him. It is not the clash between courtly love and heavenly love so much as the clash between courtly love and feudal loyalty that interests Malory. Here, indeed, the sense of doom rises. Lancelot becomes involved in battle against those he loves, and in the end, with the Round Table destroyed, Arthur hurt to the death in the final battle in which the treacherous Mordred is slain, and Guinevere retired to a nunnery. Lancelot decides to forsake the world too, out of love and despair rather than from a religious impulse. Guinevere dies repentant, Lancelot follows soon after. And Sir Hector speaks his obituary, Launcelot, he sired, thou were head of all Christian mighties. And now I dare say, sired Sir Hector, thou Sir Launcelot, there thou liest. That thou were never matched of earthly neeties hande. And thou were the curtest my that ever be ashailed, and thou were the truest friend to thy lover that ever bestrayed or. And thou were the truest lover of a sinful man that ever loved woman, and thou were the kindest man that ever strake with sword. And thou were the godliest person that ever came among a praise of neeties, and thou was the meekest man and the gentlest that ever ate in been among the ladies. And thou wert be sternest me to thy mortal foe that ever put spare in the rest. It ends in desolation, with no comfort but memory of knightly deeds once done. Malory's prose style, which moves with a simple cogency always perfectly adapted to the narrative line which he is developing, is not easily placed in the history of English prose. He is outside the tradition of English devotional prose which continues from Anglo-Saxon times to the Tudor and Elizabethan translations of the Bible. He begins by capturing something of the rhythms, and using some of the alliterative devices of Middle English literative verse as represented by the verse romance Morte d'Arthur, he simplifies, tightens up, adds weight and precision in. At the same time a conversational flow. He learns as he writes. And the later books show a fine ease in dialogue together with a dignity and eloquence which derive at least in part from the heroic element in the Morte d'Arthur. The flow is simple enough, marked by such conjunctions as and, for, but, then, and, therefore, tilde. The underlying rhythms provide a quiet emotional groundswell to the narrative. The dialogue is lively and often captures the individual quality of a character. The accounts of action rise and fall with a restrained epic movement which has quiet gravity without magniloquence. The result of it all is an impressive summing up of the matter of Britain as seen through the perspective of the Indian summer of the age of chivalry, excessive sentiment, the pure devotional note, and overabundant narrative complication are equally pruned away, and Malory gives us the Arthurian stories set to an uncomplicated chivalric morality. But the epic note does not really belong to these nostalgic stories of a lost way of life. The defects of the code are manifest in the actions which are based on it. And in the end the heroic is modulated into elegy. It is paradoxical that William Caxton, who brought the art of printing to England, should have been so interested in chivalry and old romance. But the late 15th and early 16th century was a transitional period in which all sorts of paradoxical things are likely to happen. The work of Berkeley and Hawes showed both old medieval modes and new humanist influences. Humanism itself was one element in that complex movement we call the Renaissance. A movement whose reality has recently been questioned but which certainly was real, though its manifestations were not as sudden or its causes as simple as was once thought. The world of medieval Christendom, set against the militant Muslim world which bound it on the south and east, had a significant religious and cultural uniformity. Its intellectual and imaginative boundaries were limited, the scholar moving within the limits of Latinitas, the philosopher and the scientist working deductively on truths taken from authority. The poet rendering his vision of past and present through notions of order and significance common to the whole of medieval Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, we know, was never more than an ideal. But the ideal represented a view of history and of society that lay behind most of the superficially differing attitudes which intelligent men in the Middle Ages expressed. The shift from the view of the Roman Empire as divinely ordained machinery for the Christianizing of the Western world to a view of the pagan culture of Greece and Rome as something more civilized, more splendid, more fully illustrative of what man can make of himself by cultivation of the arts and sciences than any subsequent phase of history, represented a real revolution in thought. And while it would be wrong to see this shift as simply the rapid result of the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, with the consequent emigration of Greek-speaking Christians from the Eastern Empire to Italy, for it was a slow process that had been going on since long before 1453, it would be ridiculous to assert that because the movement was gradual it did not take place. The writing of history is impossible without making generalizations, and it is impossible to make generalizations unless one deliberately cultivates the proper perspective. A cause is known as a cause by its effect. If looked at by itself it is simply an isolated phenomenon, and if looked at with reference to preceding events it becomes itself an effect. History's continuous movements are arbitrary categories of the historian, but significant changes do occur, attitudes do alter radically, the old order does give place to the new. And the Renaissance is not a fiction of the historian's imagination. Medieval Christendom established itself in the chaos that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. It took over what it could from the Roman world, compromised where it had to with both old pagan and new barbarian, and achieved a synthesis in which the thought and institutions of the classical world played a certain limited part. Humanism, that movement which represented the desire to recover the purest ideals of Greek and Latin expression and to assimilate the most civilized aspects of classical thought, was essentially an attempt to get behind the medieval synthesis, to approach the original sources of classical culture directly, not through the medium of clerical Latinitas. Italy had known this movement since the 14th century, and long before it reached England it had exerted its influence on Italian literature. North of the Alps the humanist movement became more directly involved in religious and moral questions. The ambitious and ubiquitous machinery of the medieval church was ceasing to function effectively. Satire of clerical abuses, amusedly ironical in Chaucer, soon swelled to an angry and bitter chorus. And this encouraged the avant-garde to turn to the secular thought of the classical world for guidance and enlightenment. That secular thought, touched with the moral earnestness of Christian protest against abuses of Christian institutions, produced a school of Christian humanists which was to include reformers who remained within the Roman Catholic fold as well as Protestants. It must be remembered too that the New Learning, as it was often called in the 16th century, encouraged the study of Hebrew as well as of Latin and Greek, and that the great German humanist Daiches was even more important for the development of Hebrew studies in Europe than the great Dutch humanist Erasmus was for the study of Greek. Hebrew and Greek, the languages of the Old and New Testaments respectively, were essential tools in any new approach to the Bible. If pre-Protestant reforming thought demanded vernacular Bible translation, it was the new scholarship of the humanists that eventually made that translation possible from the original sources. Thus humanism in spite of itself was drawn into new religious movements. We have already noted the changes in the economic basis of society that were bringing about the end of feudalism. In the towns, A new upper class of merchants and professional men joined hands with the landowners in the country, where a prospering gentry were enclosing common land in the interests of sheep farming. To the distress of the peasants who were thus deprived of the opportunity of tilling the soil and forced to roam the countryside in search of work. Individualism asserted itself in economic as in other areas. The political genius of Henry VII, whose accession to the throne in 1485 after his victory over Richard III brought to an end the Wars of the Roses and ushered in the new Tudor despotism, enabled him to win the loyalty of merchant, professional man, gentry and nobility alike, and so to maintain a political stability in the country of which it was in desperate need, and at his death to leave a secure throne to his son. Henry VII thought of himself as a medieval monarch re-establishing a medieval monarchy, and did not see the implications of his own reign. He was no friend to humanists. But with the accession of Henry VIII in 1509, the humanists in England had their chance, and the early years of his reign were years of promise and excitement for English culture. The scene changed in the latter part of Henry's reign, when Henry's insistence on divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his break with Rome, his suppression of the monasteries and the consequent destruction of so many English art treasures, and his assumption of the supreme headship of the English Church lost him the approval of such a moderate Catholic humanist as Sir Thomas More, whose execution for high treason in 1535 marks the end of Henry's alliance with the most attractive elements of contemporary humanism and arrested the humanist movement in England for a generation. More scholar, statesman, diplomat, political theorist, the ideal commonwealth described in his Latin work Utopia represents a humanist rather than a Christian conception of the state, and patron of the arts, represented all that was best in the new ideal of culture. His piety led him to seek to purify rather than radically to reorganize the Church, and he remained devoted to papal supremacy. Like Erasmus, he wished to remove corruption without changing theological doctrine or ecclesiastical structure. But unlike the Dutch humanist, he became involved in practical affairs to his own undoing. He remains the glory and the tragedy of Henry VIII's reign. The new learning had made itself felt in England as early as the 15th century, but these early manifestations left no permanent mark. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, William Gray, later Bishop of Ely, John Free of Balliol College, Oxford, and John Gunthorpe, later Dean of Wells, all visited Italy in the latter part of the 15th century and returned with Latin manuscripts which they left to Oxford College libraries. But it was not until the introduction of Greek learning into England that a more permanent enthusiasm for classical scholarship was aroused. Thomas Linacre, William Grocyn, who returned from Italy in 1490 to teach Greek at Oxford, and William Latimer put Greek studies on a firm footing at Oxford. While at Cambridge, the teaching of Greek by Erasmus from 1510 to 1513 gave a great impetus to Greek studies. John Colet, who had studied in Paris in Italy and was a friend of Erasmus, lectured on the New Testament at Oxford at the turn of the century, and in 1510, then Dean of St. Paul's, endowed the Cathedral School of St. Paul's to bring the new learning into secondary education. Richard Croke, who had studied Greek at Oxford with Grocyn and then studied at Paris and lectured at several continental universities, returned to Cambridge in 1518, where, the following year, he was appointed reader in Greek. He was succeeded by Sir Thomas Smith, and in 1540, when 5 new Regis chairs were founded by Henry, Smith got that of civil law, while Sir John Cheke became professor of Greek. Cheke, hailed by Milton in one of his sonnets as having taught Cambridge and King Edward Greek, later became tutor to the young King Edward VI. He did more than any other single person to make Greek studies popular in England. The history of scholarship becomes important for the history of literature at this time because the new classical scholarship meant the establishment of direct contact with the achievements of Classical culture in this in turn meant not only new ideals in literary style but new concepts of civilization, and a sense that the Middle Ages had represented a vast deflection of progress of the arts and sciences off their true course. Further, the recovery of Greek science, which was one of the great achievements of humanism, that too little realized, meant that Renaissance science could begin where Greek science had left off. Astronomy, physics, and medicine profited by this renewed contact with Greek thought. The scientific discoveries of the 16th and 17th centuries were made possible by the work of the 15th century humanists. In the Middle Ages, Greek science, and indeed much Greek philosophy, was only available in fragmentary and often distorted form through Latin translations from the Arabic, for the Muslim world were early heirs of Greek thought. Now it became freely and directly available. No wonder that Renaissance thinkers came to regard the Middle Ages simply as an obstacle standing between them and the pure knowledge of the classical world. The ages of Gothic superstition, which was all the 17th and still more the early and middle 18th century could see in the Middle Ages, were so regarded because they blocked the light of classical culture. But this survey has taken us well beyond the transitional period. In the next chapter we shall examine in some detail the new movement and its consequences for literature.